Okay. Hey, Murray, you back?
Yes, I'm back on.
How you doing?
Well, as usual, of course, for anybody that's not too familiar with the show, I'm about a minute behind whatever you've just been talking about.
No, that's quite all right. You know what we were planning on talking about this next segment was when to throw your reserve.
Yep. Well, can I just put in one wee bit on the last segment?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
This, again, is something that we sort of teach quite a bit because of the type of flying that we do here, where we may have a large open expanse and a hill. So in the morning or in the evening, depending on which site you're flying and what time of day, obviously, one side of the hill is in shadow. And this very nicely ties in with the magic lift. One thing pilots should always remember if they're going into land before the lift has run out, in a magic lift situation, is that there's a high chance that on the side of the valleys you have a downslope airflow. So instead of the normal landing procedure that they would usually do, they're thinking of flying the way they would normally do, down the slope, into landing. Instead of that, they should be flying along the contour to assess, as they go down through any wind shear, whether they have an upslope, a downslope, or a calm air. Now, added into that, they should also be looking at the way that the main valley slopes. And instead of flying down the main valley while going along the contour, it's normally better to be flying slightly up valley direction, because any airflow along the sides and low down will tend to not only flow from the top of the hill down into the valley, but will also tend to flow down the valley itself.
Well, I'll give you a great example of what happened to a friend of mine, and he paid a pretty dear price for it, but we were out flying this beautiful site that I mentioned earlier today in the Laguna Mountains, 3,000 foot down to the LZ. At the end of the day, we were out flying in the valley, and one of my flying partners ended up on the side of the mountain, and all of a sudden, he's flying and he's going back and forth and he's trying to pick up lift and he's sinking and he's sinking and he's sinking and he goes down, 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 down. He keeps thinking, scratching, well, I'm going to get something coming up, something's going to happen. Well, about 100 foot off the deck, he realizes that he's going to go to the deck, and he turns out away from the mountain, and there's a big boulder outcropping landing area near the base of the mountain, which he was forced to land in. He couldn't fly over the top and get to the desert sand, and ended up crashing into a big, huge rock pile, and hurt his ankle. And in the meantime, he's sitting on the ground cussing and swearing, because in the valley out away from the ridge, everybody's up, and he really didn't understand what had happened. It had gone katabatic, and the airflow alongside of the mountain was strictly going down. It was like a down cycle washing him down, but everything out in the valley was going up. And so here he is, he's ridge soaring back and forth all the way down. He drops down 1,000 feet before he realizes he's almost going to hit the ground, and he tries to fly out over the croppings. And this was a real good lesson, because if we understand that winds go katabatic, in other words, blow down, adiabatic, they blow up, this can oftentimes change just around sundown or just before sunset, when all of a sudden you have a different airflow occurring, and lift won't always be the same near the edge of the mountain as it will be out in the valley floor.
Yeah, it's one of the things, it's not quite day one training, but right back at the start, we start making pilots aware of this. And the other thing is that while everything you said there is perfectly correct, again, the danger with that is it gives pilots a certain mindset. So in the evenings, they expect it. But maybe they're only having to go to work in the afternoon. They've got a half day off in the morning, so they go out for a morning flight, which they don't normally do. They're flying a site which, to give an example, and this I actually have done, a big westerly site, miles of open land in front of it, a nice 12 to 15 knot westerly at the top of the ridge. But I had to get back to work, so I could only go out for an hour or so. Now, being a westerly site in the morning, the face of the hill is in shadow. Round about 300 feet below the ridge height, I went through an area of turbulent air. But because I know about these things, I knew the only reason for turbulent air there is wind shear. That means I have the prevailing westerly wind, and the air below it is not blowing westerly. So I came down, spot landing, flying straight east into the hill, to a 0-step spot landing on the hill, and then the wing just nicely dropped down downslope of me, ending up with the wing 6 foot above the path, gathered up as I walked down, stepped onto the path, round to the pickup, and to the local sail-playing club for breakfast. Katabatic can happen in the morning as well as evening.
Right.
As long as pilots think about the science and they train from this from the start to be aware of it, they don't have problems. But if they're not aware of it, they can spend a lot of time, and time in paragliding is height. They can burn up a lot of time, get low, no options. If he landed high flying into the hill, or immediately headed straight out, he'd have been okay.
There you
Anyway,
go.
your new subject.
Well, listen, I thought what I'd do is maybe we could brainstorm a little bit. One of the ideas that I try to get across to a lot of people in the sport is that we normally try to set up a plan in your mind mentally, and I do a lot of this mental picturing and posturing in my flying career, and I think in some ways it's been very helpful to me because creating mental imagery again is part of the training of a good pilot. And one of the things that I've done for myself, I've set up parameters, not only when I want to get out of the sky, but when I might end up needing to throw my reserve chute. I'd certainly be interested in hearing what your thoughts are in that regard, and we could share perhaps our combined knowledge with some of our listeners.
Well, the first thing here is an admission. Now, as a general rule, I never fly with a reserve because of the methods that current reserves are used. That's why I've been working for the last year or so on a variation which is much closer to the way that reserves are deployed from the parachuting. Now, this is not a case of me trying to encourage people not to fly with reserves. If you're flying big flights, if you're flying thermal flights, certainly if you're flying crowded sites, you should be flying with a reserve. This is a personal thing. This is not to encourage other folks to go there. Having said that, in the UK they seem to reckon that round about 1/3 of all reserve deployments are accidental. So while the reserves themselves are undoubtedly excellent and they save a lot of lives, we have to review the way that we are installing and using reserves. Now, on the line of that, I went out one day, and in the space of just over an hour, I did 5 low-level reserve deployments, mimicking what happens in an accidental deployment. In an accidental deployment, your glider is flying perfectly well until the point where the reserve deploys. And as you've mentioned more than a few times, David, on the show, a lot of times you'll see pilots, when they're having to deploy the reserve, they let go their controls, they reach for the reserve, and as they deploy it, the glider recovers.
Right. That's
so
very
you've got to
common.
go back to the root. You've got to look at why are reserve deployments being made. Mid-airs and all the rest of it. Do we need better training and more awareness and avoid the mid-airs? Having said that, we live in a real world. Pilots do need to deploy reserves. The technology is getting better, it's getting lighter, it's getting more reliable. The weakness in most systems is the human factor.
Right. This slightly ties in with some of the conversation that we earlier had when we were talking about stress and mental overloading and soaring. And as you pointed out, oftentimes when we're overloaded and stressed, we throw the reserve, and just before the reserve deploys and opens, the glider starts flying again. I've seen that happen so many times.
Even worse than that is the time delay
Yeah.
until deploying the reserve, so the energy actually builds up. So again, training comes in there. Deploying the reserve, you don't want to build up energy, you don't want to be spinning around. If you are in a situation where you can't recover from it, you should have the training to be able to recognize that and not delay. You want to use that time wisely.
Well, again, it's amazing because I think one of the things that very few people think about, unless they've been properly trained, is I should try to set up some parameters that may help me define when a situation would warrant a reserve deployment. And as you so aptly pointed out, many of these things aren't really thought out. In fact, many of them are accidental, and that also is a training issue, because I find that oftentimes when these reserves are accidentally deployed is because a safety check wasn't done prior to the flight. In other words, they weren't checking to see where the reserve pin was, or they maybe inadvertently had people helping them launch, and somebody brushed up or pulled the reserve handle accidentally. This is it gets into a whole nother topic. I have a rule for myself, is that I don't want people touching me and putting their hands on me unless I authorize it, just for that one reason alone. Unless I'm just totally out of control and being drugged through the audience, or innocent bystanders, which seldom ever. In fact, I don't ever recall it ever happening. But the point is that the parameters that I've set up for myself, and maybe I can start off with just sharing that. I've set up several parameters that would warrant me, in my mind, mentally, knowing that this is when I'm going to throw. And one of the parameters has to do with ground elevation and control. And in other words, if I've lost control of my glider and I've done everything possible that I could to get it back to flying, and it's not flying, I feel that once I get down to about the 500-foot mark, I'm more than likely going to throw my reserve. I'm not going to wait much past 500 foot. Most of the manufacturers recommend on most of our PDA pull-down apex reserve chutes that you have a minimum of 300 feet ground clearance to activate the reserve. And I must say, I've seen on videotape a PDA, a pull-down apex reserve, open around 100 feet, and I've seen a couple at 200 feet personally, but that's cutting it real close. In other words, the chute opens and 5 foot later you're standing on the ground.
Both yes and no on that. The testing that I did was deploying the reserve at between round about 25 and about 150 feet, and every single time there was no problem. But the key to that is vertical descent speed. If you're in a spin, for some reason, say something's got snarled up in the glider and it's spinning, one of the things you need to assess before you actually deploy is the direction. You want to make sure you're throwing your reserve in the most efficient direction, so you're not throwing it into the airflow, going past it before it loads. You want to make sure it's loading cleanly, smoothly, and as quickly as possible. Now, if your vertical descent speed is low, but you're in an emergency situation, you take your time, you make sure you deploy the correct way, and it will work. But clearly, if you have a high vertical descent speed, you've got big problems, and that is where you want to deploy early. Also, if you're very high and your problems are because you haven't noticed the cloud build-up, quite often a recommendation may be to go down, get down to 1,000 feet, get down to 500 feet before you deploy. And there were 6 Slovenian pilots, and one of them deployed his reserve, and he went up under the reserve at 60 meters a second to 21,000 feet. So again, the better training, making informed decisions as to when and which way to deploy.
Absolutely. Now you bring up a good point, because one of the parameters, again, that I've set for myself in terms of when I should throw is not to throw when I'm 10,000 feet over the ground. In other words, when you throw at very high altitude, oftentimes you haven't given yourself enough time to work out the situation. You end up, when you do, the chute does open up, you end up at 10,000 feet drifting forever, and of course you could drift over power lines, over forests, over rivers, over lakes, and end up in one of those obstacles. So the idea is that oftentimes you can't control your descent, or you have very little ability to control unless you're flying a steerable, which most of us don't, and therefore it doesn't make any sense to throw at very, very high altitudes where you might end up in greater risk, landing somewhere where you don't want to land. So that's another parameter that I set for myself. Another parameter might be in the event of a mid-air collision. If I was able to get tangled up with somebody and not get untangled, I would probably more than likely throw my reserve. That would be another scenario.
One of the things you might sort of consider is that. Now, again, this is a busy site situation, and we'll presume for a second that we're talking about 2 paragliders. Now, assuming that the tangle is such that they are not going to separate, there's an odds that one of them is at least providing a certain amount of lift. If you've got the time, and there's a high chance that you will, you may have, say, 5 seconds. Don't just immediately throw. Say to the other person, I'm going to throw, or are you going to throw, or something like that. If that is appropriate, we're not saying do this, but if it's appropriate, if there's 2 of you together, if you've got the time, take a couple of seconds to work out who's going to do what. You throw 2 reserves together, you've still got a problem. You throw one, and then deploy the other one, they're more likely to work.
Well, yeah, that could be the case, and yeah, there's an awful amount of guesswork that's involved, because I'll be honest with you, when you're tangled up with something and you have two canopies that are now out of control and you throw a reserve, the danger or the likelihood is that one of them could get tangled up around the parachute, and that would also heighten your chances of coming down real hard and fast. Listen, we're up for a break already. You want to hang in there,
What
Murray?
I'm going to do is I'll phone back in about 5 minutes' time.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, this is David and Murray Hayes out of Scotland talking paragliding to our worldwide crew, and we'll be right back after this intermission. And welcome back to my paragliding audience. Thank you for listening. It's been almost 2 hours now that we've been on air, and I still haven't run out of things to talk about. It's pretty amazing when you consider you can sit in a studio with 4 walls all around you and talk to 2 hours to yourself. And luckily, I've been assisted by Bill and Murray and Gabriel and some of you other guys that have called in, and I do appreciate that very much, because I seldom talk to myself for this long until I get to the studio. But then when I get here, I usually don't have enough time to say all the things that I want to say. So we were talking about reserve deployments. And Murray, you still with us?
Yes, I'm indeed. Or rather, I should say I'm back. Being the Scotsman route.
Yeah, I knew you disappeared, but they may not have even noticed that you were gone, because it was just a break. It just got over with, and here you are. But we had kind of an interesting incident talking about reserve deployments. This is something oftentimes people say, well, do you practice these? No, we simulate reserve deployments. You actually had an experience of actually practicing one 5 times at low level, but for the most part, it's not something that we practice here in Southern California unless we're happen to be over a lake, and oftentimes at the end of an SIV clinic, a safety clinic, one of the last tasks that will be done for the very last flight is a reserve deployment, and therefore you come down under your reserve and land in water. And this opens up a whole nother bucket of worms for anybody that's landed in water.
Well, we're starting doing 2 things. I didn't get the chance to do it last year, but we should be doing it this year. One is with our members. I'll actually be going out and doing a reserve deployment so they can watch it, because seeing somebody do something like that gives them a much better picture. Looking at a video is great, but if you can actually see somebody on the site that you normally fly that's, well, shall we say, mad enough or good enough or whatever to actually do this is an advantage. The other thing which we didn't get the chance to do last year, but we will be doing this year, is doing some water landings in conjunction with the lifeboat service and filming those and putting together a whole training procedure for that, because flying on the east coast of Scotland, we've got a lot of sea cliff sites.
Yeah.
So clearly, training procedures, having something that people can actually see again, is good stuff.
Well, I would love and hope that regardless if you do the water landing or just the deployment, that you get it on video and you can share it with us, because it might be something that we can create on the web here that can be shown while we're talking about it.
Well, I don't want to give the game away too much, because this is for a future article for Paraglider magazine, but the other thing which I'll be shooting is the downwind landing technique. And again, on one of our coastal sites, we have a park, and I regularly on suitable days there do downwind landings with a 50-knot tailwind to within a metre of my target spot, and I'll do that 10 times in a row, standing with maybe 3-4 steps. And it's a combination of that technique which we've developed with the water landing ideas. It's putting the whole thing together, and it's all about aviation. It's about training and developing procedures for situations that in an ideal situation you would never get into, but it happens.
Well, one of the things that happens in water landings, and it's almost a curse, is that most of our harnesses nowadays have a very big moose bag in the back of them, and you oftentimes will hear guys say that when they land in the water, one of the most difficult things is that the harness tends to roll them over onto their face and float them face down in the water, and so they struggle to stay with their head above the water so they can obviously breathe. And this happens frequently when people are making these parachute landings or sometimes crash landings from SIV clinics because it's not a controlled landing. In other words, usually they don't even realize they're going to hit the water until about 5 seconds before they hit. And at that point, the glider's not under control, so they're not able to bring the canopy, either land it in front of them or behind them where they would normally want to do one or the other, depending on the situation. And consequently, they go into the water and they're not prepared to be out of their harness real quickly. The glider may land in front of them, therefore the lines go over their head. They get tangled up in the lines. Now they're trying to struggle to stay up and roll over onto the side so they can breathe, and now they got lines over them. They're wrapping themselves up in lines. And fortunately, the rescue boat comes over and picks them up, a minute or less after they've hit the water, and they're relieved. But this could happen easily in a situation where there was no rescue boat. You could be, I can think a couple times where I flew across the lake and almost didn't get across it because of some turbulence or whatever. And water landings are not very exciting to look at when you're, about to go in. So, yeah, this is really a very, very complex issue.
Yeah. Well, my first key to that is the problem is pilots again revert, unsafe regression if you like. They always revert back to what they've been taught, their basic trained procedures, which may not, in these particular circumstances, be appropriate. Rather than stopping and thinking, everybody knows you should land into wind. But if you land into wind in the water, your lines are likely to go slack and the glider is going to drop on top of you. If you're landing downwind on the water and you control it and let the glider overfly, there's a very, very high chance that it'll sit there as a nice sail holding a reasonable amount of tension on the lines, and you're getting dragged along at a reasonably slow speed. So long as you have tension on the lines, there's very little risk of getting tangled in them. And that's the key. People get tangled up and they panic. If they stop and slow down and don't kick about, don't move their arms about suddenly, the lines go slack. But as soon as you start moving like struggling in quicksand, down you go.
Yeah, it is very similar, I think, talking to some of the people that have been in that situation, like being in quicksand, because the more you struggle, the more wrapped up and tied up you get with these lines. And then you get into a situation where you're near panic.
Yep.
And the near panic situation, again, this fight syndrome is counterproductive. It requires a thought process of cool, calm collectiveness, and you can't get that. You won't get it unless you've trained and you've
hyperventilation.
Yeah.
So your blood acid's going to go because you're flushing too much carbon dioxide out. You're getting the panic attack. You start wanting to do something, whereas all you really need to do, slow down, stop, relax, chill out, and get yourself out of the situation. But the key has got to always go back to this basic idea. Before you do anything, if you have time, you need to stop and think. Fair enough, there are occasions when you don't really have time, and that's where pre-training and pre-planning comes in. But the rest of the time, most situations, whether you're in the water or in the air, if you slow down, breathe, think, you can solve it for yourself, or at least give yourself that 5 minutes that keeps you alive while you sort things out and the rescue boat arrives.
Right. Well, the harness, it's interesting because it does float, and if you're able to extract yourself from the harness right after hitting the water, you can always use it as a flotation device and be on top of it and not panic. But the problem is, I know in this most recent one where I spoke with one of my former students, he didn't plan the landing. It just came up on him so quick, and all he could do was roll over on his side, and he used both his hands with all the strength that he had to keep his head up above the water, and that's all he was able to do until the boat came up and picked him up. And he said by that time he was already starting to get tangled in the lines, and he was growing tired and weak, and had the boat not been there, he wasn't sure just what the outcome would be. And I can understand that. It's a pretty traumatic situation. We've had a couple water landings that have ended up in not so pleasant situations. So it's something you need to think about, and there's obviously solutions to every problem, and if you can start to work and train towards those solutions, I think the problems get greatly minimized, as you know.
Well, there's one way into that, in that while you're still high, assuming that you're coming down in an unintentional water landing, so it's you're not coming down under reserve, you're flying down to the water. First thing to do is disconnect your speed system. Because even if you disconnect from the glider, if your speed system's still attached, you can't get away. So while you're high, disconnect your speed system if it's not going to be doing any good to you. Tuck it away. Cut it away. Anything that can tangle you, that you can get rid of and replace cheaply, get rid of it. Once you're on the water, you can then release your glider. Now, if you have a screw gate, obviously you don't want pilots flying about without the carbs done up properly, but if you're coming down, you know you're on the water, and you've got screw gate ones, release the screws, so that once you hit the water, again, you can pop out. Stay in the harness, but undo your buckles, and don't just undo them. If you can, tuck them out of the way. Every time you've got time when you're in the air, think about things that once you hit the water could be a hazard, and if you can do something about it, do it about it then.
Well, let me just say that in reality, you may not be able to unscrew the gates while you're descending out of the sky. But one of the things that I carry, and I think all pilots should carry if they have any possibility of flying near water, is a hook knife. And a hook knife, man, I've cut through pretty thick webbing in just a matter of a second. I mean, just rip it right through. Your adrenaline's going, you're going to have an extraordinary amount of power, and if with a good hook knife, you can cut through quite a bit of stuff. So that's probably going to be the solution for a lot of you that do happen to be in or near any bodies of water to fly with a hook knife. It's just a cheap $20 item, or 10-pound item that you could attach to your harness, and if you get tied up in line, or if you need to get away from stuff quick, cut it.
And again, don't wait until you're on the water. If you've got a hook knife, put the strap of it round your wrist, have it in your hand, so that once you're on the water, you're not having to waste time to find it. So, next week's show, are we coming up to about that time to talk about it?
Yeah, I think next week we're gonna try to get into a little bit more about some of this great flying that Gabriel experienced over in Romania. And one of the things that we may want to talk about, if you want to bone up on it, is high wind kiting, high wind launching.
I do a lot of that.
Yeah, I know you do, and I thought maybe we could put together a little bit of a presentation on high wind stuff. So that might be something.
If some of the listeners can also think about how many ways can you control and influence a paraglider without using the brakes when you're kiting? And I can think of at least a dozen. So perhaps if we get listeners involved, maybe phoning in or emailing with the number of different methods they can think of control that doesn't increase the drag and lets you control a paraglider while on the ground.
Sounds good, Murray. I want to thank you very much for your participation.
My pleasure as always.
Okay, and look forward to seeing you next week, big guy.
Hopefully.
Thank you again.
Bye just now.
Okay, this is David Jebb with the Paragliding Show. We're going to sign off with a couple brief announcements. One is